structure over here. This is an old fountain, which was destroyed in the 18th century and subsequently rebuilt after the earthquake. But in the 16th century, this is what the fountain looked like. Okay, before the earthquake, this is what the fountain looked like. It had about 3 arches, 6 fountain heads. You can see the gate where we just walked from. Of the arch. But what's more interesting about this painting is not the fountain itself, but the people portrayed around it. Okay, you notice that there's an abundance of African faces. A lot of them are carrying these red pots. Part of the day-to-day routine of slaves that lived in Lisbon is that they would go to the different water fountains, collect the water, and bring it home to their masters. And then they would also be responsible for emptying the chamber pots. So where people, did their needs, they would have to take the buckets and throw them into the river. And if you look at this person over here, he's had a bit of an accident. The pot sort of broke or flipped over his head, and you can see all the filth around him. Then you also see some other intriguing elements. You see this musician with a tambourine and a boatman. You see a bodyguard protecting these 2 merchants. You will find...
And there's a black guy as well, isn't there?
Yes. You'll find a black man dancing with a white woman. Interracial relationships at the time weren't forbidden, but interreligious relationships were.
So that means you couldn't mix religion, but you could mix race?
Yes.
And then what century is that?
This would be from the late 16th century.
16th century.
And it didn't matter if you're poor or even an aristocrat. There were people who were nobles who married African women, who were mixed race and so on. So people from many different classes were getting married to people from different races.
Do you call them mulatto over here as well?
Sorry?
You call them mulatto?
Mulatto is one of the terms. It's more common in Mozambique. Here, some people, and in Brazil, some people consider it pejorative. In Mozambique, it's not. It doesn't have that much of a negative connotation. Another term is mestiço. Mestiço. But mulatto is also a very common term. Yes.
Okay. What's the one you mentioned before? You mentioned 3, didn't you? So you mentioned mulatto.
Mestiço. Mestiço, which means mixed. Basically. But another thing that I also wanted to point out is this character over here, this individual, and you can see he's a black man with very high status. He has his horse. He's armed with a sword. His cloak has the cross of St. James.
Just about see it. This guy here,
Yeah. So he was a knight of St. James, another one of the Crusader orders that lived, operated in Portugal and Spain at the time. And you had many Africans, some who were former slaves, who joined these military orders, these Crusader orders, as a way to advance in the social hierarchy.
Okay, so the way they can move along.
Exactly.
Society.
By doing military service, by joining these Crusader orders, by showing prowess in battle.
And they were Christian orders again, innit? Knights of St. James.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So you had different nominees.
You had different Crusader orders that operated in Portugal. The 3 main ones were the Knights of Christ, the Knights of St. James, and the Knights of Aviv.
Okay. Did they ever fight against each other, or they were both?
I mean, there would be some backstabbing here and there, amongst each other. But openly, I mean, they were supposedly brothers in Christ. but the Knights of St. James were more partial to the Spanish, whereas the Knights of Christ were more of a Portuguese thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But you know, like the patron saint of the Portuguese armies is St. George, and he's also a big thing in England, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's because before, when the Christians were fighting the Moors, their patron saint was St. James.
Yeah.
So whenever they rode off to battle, they would all be like, "Oh, for St. James."
Yeah.
But then when they started fighting each other, they couldn't all be shouting, you know, for the same saint.
Yeah.
So the king was like, "Okay, let's change it to St. George." You know?
Okay.
So now the Portuguese are like for St. George, the Spanish for St. James.
Okay.
But back to the topic of the painting. Do you have any questions?
No.
This painting is very interesting.
Yeah, no.
Because it reveals a few perceptions that people had at the time about Lisbon.
Yeah.
You could certainly assume that the author considered that Lisbon was home to many Africans.
Yeah.
In fact, at the time, 1 in 10 people living in Lisbon would have been a slave.
Yeah.
Okay. And that meant there was roughly around 10 to 15,000 slaves that lived in Lisbon in the late 16th century, and that number was more or less constant throughout the 17th and 18th century. However, not every person that lived in not every slave was African, and not every African was a slave. Okay.
Okay.
So you have the African knight, for example. He was certainly not a slave.
African knight. What's that?
This person here, the knight.
Yeah. Sorry, I can say properly. So this guy here.
He was a Crusader knight.
Okay.
Okay.
But did he start off as a slave?
Some of them start off as slaves. But not every African who came to Lisbon came as a slave. You actually had some African kings who came to Lisbon on state visits. The king of the Congo, King Afonso. He came to Lisbon in the 16th century. And he was received with grand state honors as well. And some African princes would also come to Lisbon to study theology, to study some sciences as well, and then come back.